Good evening, friends. Welcome to another Word of Gord in the series Average Folks in the Afterlife. I'm going to be reading probably from, 2 or 3 sessions here, reading and discussing this book called Excursions to the Spirit World, published, I believe, in 1961 by Fredeick Sculthorp. Just discovered this book in the last month or so, and it's very, very high quality. Mr. Sculthorp discovered, with the help of his guides, that he could do consciousness projection to spirit well and remember it accurately, much more so than most. And his recall and his perception of detail is so precise in many occasions. I would compare him to the current champion of consciousness projection in my mind, Jürgens Yu, whose 2 books are just milestones in the genre, milestones of consciously remembered detail. Mr. Sculthorp, I can't find out very much about him, other than he did 2 books, one in 61 and one in 75, and seemed to have almost disappeared from the record. You hear mentions of Oliver Fox and Yi Ram and various other early pretenders to the crown from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, at least in English. But you never hear about Fredeick Sculthorp, and I aim to change that a little. We're going to delve in, and I'm just going to start and enjoy. Before telling of my conscious astral projections, which I have experienced for more than 20 years, it will be necessary to describe how this curious faculty of mine started and how it came into full sway. An exposition of this background will be of interest to skeptics and believers alike, and truly of help to many. An exteriorization is not such a rare occurrence as one might presume, but anybody experiencing it without previous knowledge will be alarmed, and often quite unnecessarily become afraid of becoming mentally deranged. Thus, more knowledge is necessary and should be disseminated. Don't forget, this is 1961 when it was published, and I think a good deal of the notes were taken in the 40s and 50s, when this was, a rare, well, not so much a rare accomplishment, but a rare accomplishment to actually be published and talked about. Perhaps the circumstances in my case were especially helpful, or I had a talent without knowing it. I cannot offer any elucidation in this respect. Previous to my wife's passing in 1934, I was as ignorant as the majority of people concerning life after death, and the whole idea seemed to me fantastic. The loss of my wife was a great blow to me, as we happened to be living in happiness. We had 2 children, and I had a shop to attend to. But I was fortunate in living on my shop premises, and as my aunt came to live with me, the children were well cared for. I tried to keep my interest in the vast material obtainable on the loan from the local library, where for some years I had obtained food for thought. One of my favourite writers was Sir Oliver Lodge, the scientist and president of the British Association, and I was interested in his accounts of experiments in the field of electricity and electromagnetic waves. In the library one day I happened to notice a book by him, the title of which was Why I Believe in Personal Immortality. Lodge, of course, was famous in his day and wrote a book about his survival of his son called Raymond, which was a huge bestseller in, I think, 1917, 1918, 1919, so he would be a name to follow. I was surprised that Sir Oliver had written a book on this subject, as his scientific experiments, and in them he was very thorough and would test a thing in many different ways and would not be satisfied until all his findings agreed. I was curious to see how he would test immortality, and on reading the book I found that the Scientific Lodge had, as usual, carefully collected evidence over a considerable period and also devised certain unusual tests. The results of these seemed to him to be conclusive, and the case for informality proved. The proof came through those strange, as they then seemed to me, people called mediums, who possessed a finely tuned sense that enabled them to see and describe the spirits of the people who had passed from this life, or who had in other ways served as links to the spirit world. I decided to read more, and in my search for suitable material, I found there was a considerable amount of literature dealing with the subject. I also read as many books as I could find by those who held the opposite view and considered survival of death and communication with the so-called dead to be a fallacy. However, I found that the writers of these latter books were not careful investigators, but mostly voiced personal opinions or criticism of the findings of others. Therefore, I decided to embark on an investigation of my own to find out, if possible, which side was right. I went to the Marylebone Spiritual Association, then in Russell Square, now the Spiritual Association of Great Britain, in Belgrave Square, London, and asked for a sitting with one of their mediums. Been there myself once, 2001 I think it was. It was suggested I should try a clairvoyant medium called Miss Heron Spears. I followed her to a small sunny room containing 2 armchairs, and as we sat down she asked if I'd ever had a sitting before. When I replied no, rather curtly, she looked rather dubious and responded, "Well, don't expect much then." Soon Mrs. Spears began to describe a lady whom she declared to see clairvoyantly, saying it was my wife. The description she gave of my wife was correct, but I made no comment. She went on relating with all personal characteristics and expressions of my wife, details of my daily life, what had happened during the 3 months I thought my wife was dead. I wrote steadily, asking test questions now and then, which were answered correctly without hesitation. The communicator spoke of how the children were faring and referred to my alterations and events in the home that were known only to me. She spoke of relatives she had left behind and of those she had met on the other side, even one from a remote village. I could not doubt that it was my wife, giving all evidence of her presence she knew that I wanted. I wrote for an hour, the allotted time, but the medium seemed to be content to act as a go-between, and although my notebook was nearly full, she still went on at last until there was a knock on the door to warn us that the room was wanted for another sitting. The last thing Mrs. Spears said as we left the room together was, "Why not try it yourself? You will see your wife as clearly as you see me now." So there's a bit of time after that where he tries to become a medium, and he has some early successes. For example, during my early efforts to develop clairvoyance, I found that sometimes I could see my spirit helpers after going to bed at night. I would lie perfectly still and at ease until even the results of the bodily activity going upstairs had subsided and the breathing had become quiet and shallow. At that time, I began to have dreams that were very clear and seemed like actual spirit experiences, and I thought these might have some connection with astral travel. I believe that all earnest seekers have spirit experiences during sleep. All habits of the physical mind are mirrored on the spirit mind. The habit of opening the physical mind and searching for spiritual truth opens the spiritual counterparts. Later I have been shown this in spirit. The spirits call it searching for the grains of gold, a very apt expression. Thus our searching makes the spirit teacher's work much easier. Once when I was sitting in my armchair and striving for snatches of clairvoyance, I seemed to be held in the arms of a great spirit friend. We rose high in the air, so it seemed, and then, suspended in space, he said, "Why do you want clairvoyance? Why do you want direct voice? Why do you want materialization? You will have something much better than all these." Then I was returned to the armchair. It was rather overwhelming, as I could not imagine a companion with such a wealth of love, and wondered what could be a better spirit experience than materialization. I was soon to know, because my travels started shortly afterwards. For several months, it seemed a long time, I strove to develop this extreme passivity after getting into bed until I could keep my consciousness for a time on that knife-edge state between consciousness and sleep, after all bodily feeling had gone. And that's a toughie, that's a rare trick. Sometimes I seemed to be floating, but I thought that was due to my imagination, as no bodily weight can be felt in this state. Then one night the floating sensations became a reality, and I felt myself really rising. Inwardly excited but determined to remain passive so as not to interfere with the experiment, I was pleased to note that I had become highly sensitive and could feel the presence of a calm and friendly spirit helper. The motion, with complete absence of effort on my part, was slow. Then suddenly I began to vibrate violently. There we go, vibrate violently. I'm sure a lot of you will identify with that one. After a while this ceased and I continued to move upwards for a short time and then stopped. Thinking it was about time I abandoned my complete passivity, I looked around and found myself standing behind a table in a room. A line of young men were passing in front of the table and smiling at me. They all appeared to be dressed in blue, and for a moment I thought they were clad in the blue clothing worn in the army hospitals I had been in during the 1914-18 war. Then my sight improved. The blue became a slight mist which surrounded each one, and I saw that they were actually wearing ordinary clothes. See, he sort of rises a little and his perceptions change. As you move through even the tiniest bit of a sub-level, your perceptions will change, which, as you've heard me say before, means perceptions define reality. This is a very important point, and we tend to forget that what we're doing right now, including me, is perception. I'm looking at the book, I'm looking at the screen, I'm thinking about you. It's all perception. If I raised my vibration in meditation, I'd be perceiving other things. So there is really no reality, just a whole series of perceptions. And I say that not to be depressing or gloomy. To me, it's just makes life more fun. Anyway, wearing ordinary clothes. They all appeared to be about 23 years of age, and I was amazed at the perfect colouring of their complexions and eyes, which were beautiful by earthly standards. Wondering whether I was experiencing some exceptionally good clairvoyance, I looked round and saw that another young man was standing by my side. He had a happy smile, and I could sense the great friendliness in his aura. I realized that this was not clairvoyance and that we were on the same plane in spirit together, and therefore I must be in my spirit body for the time being. I felt very excited, and my mind began working at top speed in the desire to know more. Would they feel solid to me and I to them? How could I find out? It would appear rude to go up to one of these splendidly-looking young men and deliberately touch him. Quickly I evolved an ingenious scheme. I would pass behind the young man who stood by my side and in brushing by him would say, "Excuse me," in a casual manner. Thus I would be able to touch him apparently by chance. I did this, but when I touched him, he at once grasped my hands and burst out laughing. I had to laugh too, as I realized that as our auras mingled, he became aware of all my thoughts and I of his. And certainly that's been my experience, as I've mentioned several times in several different places. One's auras mingle. Say when I'm doing a retrieval, and or a rescue, as some people call them, and I pick up thoughts without, I may be debating or dialoguing with the confused soul that needs to be helped and moved on, and talking on one level. But as I'm doing that, there's a whole other range of thoughts that you pick up from the aura about their recent past, about their relationships, any number of things. And that's because your auras are mingling. Your energy bodies are mingling. And, one more nail in the coffin of, thoughts are in the brain. Well, no, they're not in the brain. They're in the aura. Just like the emotions are in the aura too. Various levels of the aura. And by that I mean that sort of, cloud around your body. Call it a cloud, call it what you want. It's an energy body around the physical body, and a lot of stuff floats through it, including thoughts and emotions. But don't expect any scientific person to even think about that. My lessons about conditions in the spirit world had begun. We are solid to others on the same plane or vibration in spirit, and our thoughts can be read as easily as a book. As we were laughing over this incident, I felt myself beginning to recede from the room. I did not wish to go, as I felt very happy, but I sensed that I was being taken back to my physical body and so remained passive. The journey back was calm and gentle. Strangely enough, as I thought, it seemed quite natural. This, I think, was due to the closeness of my spirit helper. There was a cessation of movement, but no feeling of re-entry into my physical body. Then my bodily weight and the light pressure of the bedclothes gradually became apparent. As I stared into the darkness of the bedroom with my thoughts full of this experience, there appeared above me a beautiful, solid-looking design of gold filigree work. This stayed for a while and then gradually faded away. That filigree design appears several times. Interesting phenomenon, that. The design appeared to cover the whole of the ceiling, and I had the impression that it was a symbol of success, as it appeared after each of my later excursions when they were normal. Sometimes the symbol would be in the form of a bas-relief in white marble with the flowing lines of the Grecian acanthus, and I used to wait and admire these manifestations and wonder if they were produced by the minds of old master craftsmen who had reached perfection of their art and spirit. Interesting. A perception of a design, and he thinks somebody else did it. Well, it could be. It could be a guide. On the return from projection, its spiritual influence lingers for a time, and the clairvoyant faculty is quite strong, so that the psychic structures seem clear even in the physical eyes if the room is dark. After the filigree design had disappeared, I lay in bed agog over the possibilities and even wondered if I would travel again that night, but I soon fell into a normal sleep. This first visit to the spirit world, perhaps owing to its brevity, was the only one during which I have ever retained full consciousness all the time I was out of the body. That is, from start to finish of the exteriorization. Second projection. I continued to practice development of a passive condition on going to bed each night, and a few nights later I again felt the gentle rising motion. This time I had no anxiety, wondering what was going to happen. I knew, and I waited in delightful anticipation. There was, on this occasion, no harsh vibration of my astral body. See, you don't always have to have the vibrations. I know a lot of people, mainly because of Monroe, I think they have to have the vibrations before they can sort of achieve liftoff. And that's not my experience. But, we all have different experiences. And I guessed that my spirit helpers had mastered the technique necessary in my case to get clear of the physical influence. I felt myself continuing to move with increasing speed, but I could not hold my consciousness, and the next thing I became aware of was walking up some white stone steps. On my right there was a little girl between 9 and 11, and I had my arm around her with my hand resting on her right shoulder. As I became conscious of my surroundings, I at once wondered where my wife was. Immediately, as if a telephone receiver was against my ear, I heard her voice say, "It is quite all right, Fred. We will meet later." Instantly, all feeling of anxiety left me, and as I realized the truth of what I had once read, quote, "There is no real separation in spirit," end quote. This was telepathy at its best, simple and natural. I could now concentrate my attention on my present situation. It was a delight to make contact with the child's aura, and I sensed the carefree, happy feelings of a youngster. Yet, in addition, there seemed to be the serenity and maturity of an older person. As we reached the top of the steps, I squeezed her shoulder to see if her body was built on a bony frame. It was. I was very ignorant of spirits then. Together we entered a hall which I felt was a rest home where people who had passed over recently, perhaps after physical sufferings, were gaining strength before awakening to full consciousness of spirit life. They were seated around the hall, accompanied by a relation or a helper, patiently waiting to assist them when they awakened. You'll perhaps recall, if you've read my second book, More Adventures in Eternity, me taking my then partner on an astral trip and showing her some of these. In some places they're almost like army barracks with beds lined up and down with all these sleeping dead people who don't seem to want to wake up. And they're attended to by people who are patiently, waiting for them to wake up. Sometimes just somebody like a night nurse sitting at the end of the hall with, family members, coming and going as they sort of hopefully sort of wish that they would, their loved one would awaken. But there are various belief systems, waiting for Judgment Day being a big one, and atheism and different things that cause people to just sleep on the astral plane. As we went round the hall, they appeared like people enjoying an afternoon siesta, and some had their eyes slightly open. Obviously, there's different levels of this sleeping and different intensities. When we reached the far end of the hall, I stopped before one of the resting arrivals, a stoutish man neatly dressed in a black coat and striped trousers. He opened his eyes slowly and looked at me. As he did so, a keyboard of an organ began to appear behind him, took solid form, and then faded away. This strong thought form, coming from a half-awakened one, surprised me, and I surmised that he had been an organist during his life on earth, and that this was his uppermost interest. Further along the line of seated people, I noticed a woman whose body seemed to be moving in a strange manner. It looked like an object seen in water and distorted by the refraction of the surface waves. The effect was peculiar, and I sensed a spiritual weakness and hurried past with my little girl companion. But I need not have worried. Her mind was quite calm. Halfway round the other side of the hall, we entered an anteroom which was brightly lit and crowded with helpers. A young man was placed in front of me, and I recognized him as one of my company who had been killed in Gallipoli 22 years before. Gallipoli, well, we all remember that one. Terrible massacre, mostly of Australians, I think. But Churchill can't remain guilty about that forever. His face was white and drawn and his eyes tightly closed. I had no idea what I was expected to do, but I think he was brought to me in the hope that he would see me. However, the experiment seemed to be a failure, as he either would not or could not open his eyes. Interesting point. The people that want to stay asleep for a whole variety of reasons. We re-entered the main hall, but shortly afterwards left it and began to descend a flight of white steps. Glancing downwards to make sure of my footing, as is my habit, I noticed that the little girl who wore a long dress had bare feet. This discovery caused me to comment in surprise. "Why, you have no shoes." "It does not matter," she replied. "But I must get you some shoes," I insisted. She looked agitated and repeated, "No, it does not matter." I suddenly realized the mistake I'd made. By earthly standards, the incident was slight, but my insistence had created a clash of thought with this advanced child, a thing to be avoided in spirit, where thought is everything. As we left the place, I gained the impression that my visit was over. I asked the little girl where she lived, when on earth, and she replied, "Ontario, Canada," which is exactly where I'm reading to you from, Ontario, Canada. I wanted this information to discover whether she was connected with my family. A few moments later, I saw her little form walking on, and I found myself receding from the scene on my journey back to my body. I retained my consciousness, but my sight was withdrawn, as invariably happens with me, so that I saw nothing on the way back. Nevertheless, I was content to remain passive, finding my spirit helper's presence both calm and comforting. There came the halt and a slight pause as physical feelings seemed to pour into my inert body lying on the bed, followed by a flood of thought concerning my experience. But my spirit observations were not yet over. Above, covering the ceiling, came the golden design. It looked more beautiful than ever, and I mentally thanked the spirit helpers for what they had done. There must have been many helpers, because the projection was so well timed, and the little girl was ready, waiting to take me round the institution. I wished I could have done something for the young soldier who was placed before me. I can't even remember his name. I feel sure that his condition was only a temporary one, and as he was in good surroundings, and the light in the room was brilliant, like staring into an arc light. The second and longer experience, which was complete and rounded off in an agreeable way, left me with an inner feeling of uplift and thankfulness that stayed with me throughout the day. While earnestly wishing to see my wife, I also wanted to know what life in spirit world was really like. I had read about it and heard many descriptions in seances, but some accounts are often conflicting and vague. Thus, bedtime became a very important part of my day. On the next trip, I'll just dip right into it. Suddenly I saw my wife approaching about 30 yards away. She came smiling with the familiar gait that I knew so well. I cannot attempt to describe my feelings beyond saying that I thought, at last we meet again. It is much better than the short clairvoyant visions I have had of her. She was wearing what looked like the same coat shown in a photograph of her at home. As I thought of this photograph, I suddenly aroused within me an earthly vibration of mourning, which I had felt when looking at this picture. At once I receded from the scene and in a greyness felt myself being drawn rapidly back to the physical body. With the instantaneous speed of thought, I knew I had blundered in some way. Back in bed and conscious of my body, I felt terribly disappointed, but knew I'd only myself to blame. Mourning is simply an earthly ignorance, a sorrow on account of thinking someone dead had gone forever, although spurious, superficial faith may pretend otherwise. Such a thought is an absolute negation of the truth, contrary to the law of spirit, and has the effect of lowering one's rate of vibration. And as I was not yet a permanent dweller in spirit, my lower vibration is appropriate to a physical body, and I was not allowed to linger in ignorance as on earth. How could we expect God's laws to permit the perpetuation of an untruth? There's a fair bit of talk about God's laws here, and it's an assumption more than any argument. I was beginning to see the perfection in all of God's laws, remembering my first projection, which had shown how thoughts can be exchanged when the auras of two spirits intermingle. I began to realize that all this information was being conveyed to me by my invisible spirit teacher, and I found later that if my mind was capable of understanding, the instruction continued in all my travels. I felt certain that spirit helpers would give me another opportunity of meeting my wife, and it soon happened. I was projected 2 nights later, and this time found myself standing in a country lane. I was very conscious of and was beginning to recognize the feelings that the spirit body automatically picks up when arriving in some part of the spirit world. These feelings or vibrations were very pleasant. I had imagined this would be another opportunity for me to meet my wife, but she did not appear. So I concentrated my thoughts on her and simply said, "Come!" After a short pause, my wife suddenly appeared in the lane walking toward me. I felt very happy at the success of my telepathic call. It seemed so simple and natural. Perhaps it was a lesson as many others were to follow in later travels. My wife too looked very happy, and as she came closer, I noticed that her features were exactly as they had been on Earth. Then, as our auras met, there was a transformation. I had seen the features of the progressed ones whom I thought were beautiful, but hers were perfection. She was my same companion, but different. Yet I knew her better than I'd ever done before. I would have recognized her unfailingly, even with my eyes closed, because her whole life and personality were contained within her aura, and I could sense the years of her companionship. I was also aware that she knew me better than she ever did before. There seemed to be a wonderful harmony between us, for we both uttered the same words of greeting and blessing at the same instant. After that, we did not trouble to speak with our lips. Speech was too slow. The happiness of our meeting seemed to raise us to a higher vibration, and in our spiritual unison we were able to exchange thoughts with unbelievable rapidity. Although to me this wonderful experience was only temporary, it seemed quite natural. But later I found that I could not recall our entire conversation of the physical mind, for reasons I will try to explain later. Anyway, I knew we spoke of the sadness of our first parting and of the present happy meeting. I did not know how long we remained together, but the intensity of this plane began to cause a pleasant drowsiness in me. Then I realized that my time was up, and I felt a gentle sensation of drifting. There was no sadness in this parting. We had experienced another perfect spirit law. It's interesting to me that he ascribes things like God and law to experiences. It's an interesting way of trying to define things and rope them in and tie them down. And it's just interesting to me that he does that right from the beginning, and I think he's picked that up from reading spiritualist books before he actually projects. Because spiritualists often talk about laws of spirit and God's law, and in the most humblest sort of pious kind of ways. They're not being arrogant, but it is limiting to the experience when you start putting labels on it, I feel. So, a small point. Back in the physical body and aware of the dark bedroom and ticking clock, I was filled with the wonder of this meeting and the indescribable perfection I had seen. As if to explain this perfection, something was impressed upon my mind. The words were God's image. And then the whole ceiling became filled with the pearly white image of a huge bas-relief of purest marble. The spirit craftsman seemed to be adding to his contribution in praise of the greatest craftsman of all. So what do we have there? A spirit guide that has a deep faith in the God consciousness, the creative force of the universe. And I find this as you move up in the levels and you meet more advanced spirits, higher spirits, mature spirits, whatever, they've still got beliefs, they've still got definitions, they've still got ways of seeing that are circumscribed by their cultural education, whether that is Christianity or spiritualism or theosophy or Sufism or whatever it is. And to me, the real goal is to move beyond that, beyond all those encultured perceptions, and just see things for exactly what they are. And not a representation of some other force that you want to praise or blame or whatever. All that stuff needs to be thrown away. It really does. But it takes time, even with somebody who's doing exploratory work like this, unusual exploratory work. So I think we've reached our time for tonight, and we'll didn't accomplish much, but we'll get to more either tomorrow or the day after. This is a fascinating book, and it just gets better as it goes on. And it's a classic as far as I'm concerned. I've only had it a couple of weeks, and I think it's a classic. And that's why I'm reading it to you now. And hope to see you again very soon. And until then, so long.